Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Irish Cheddar Spring Onion Biscuits. That's right, I'm featuring these beautiful biscuits for two very good reasons. First of all, St. Patrick's Day is right around the corner, and a basket of these sure would look beautiful next to all that Irish food. But also, I've never been completely thrilled with what people pass off as cheddar biscuits, since in general I find them dense and uninteresting. So, borrowing a technique from our French pastry friends, we're going to hopefully remedy that situation. So let's go ahead and get started with what's basically a fairly standard biscuit dough. And for me, that's going to start with a couple cups of self-rising flour, which is nothing more than regular flour with baking powder and salt milled right into it. And while this is very easy to make yourself, and I'll give you those measurements on the blog, for whatever reasons, biscuits work better if you use this stuff instead of making your own. And then to this, because we're going to be using buttermilk, we're also going to toss in a little bit of baking soda, which is alkaline. And when that mixes with the acidic buttermilk, it creates bubbles. Oh yeah, it's all very scientific. So we'll go ahead and mix in a little bit of baking soda, at which point we're ready to, as they say in the business, cut in the butter. So I'm going to toss in exactly 7 tablespoons of very cold butter that, as you can see, I cut into slices. And then we'll take one of these wire pastry blenders and go ahead and cut that in. And if it looks like I'm having a little bit of trouble getting that started, I am, because I froze the butter ahead of time. All right, when it comes to biscuits and similar type doughs, the colder the butter, the better. Okay, what we're trying to accomplish here is millions of little pieces of cold butter covered in flour, and not a whole bunch of butter and flour mashed together. Okay, so even though it's going to take you a little longer to get started, very cold, possibly frozen butter is the best way to go here. And as you'll see, once you get it started, it's not too bad. And we'll continue to work that over with our wire pastry cutter, or pastry blender some people call them, until we have something that looks like this. And I never know exactly how to describe this. Some people say do it until it resembles coarse crumbs, but I'm not sure that's a great description. But hey, thank God for video. Just do it until it looks like this. And what we'll do once that's been accomplished is make a little well in the center and pour in our ice-cold buttermilk. And we'll go ahead and take our fork and mix that in. And if you've made biscuits with me before, you know I don't like to mix everything very thoroughly in the bowl. Okay, what we want to do is just stir it until it starts to come together like this. And once it just starts to pull together and reaches that shaggy dough stage, what we'll do is stop mixing, flour our work surface, and finish mixing on the table. And in the initial stages here, all we're doing is kind of pressing that into a roughly shaped rectangle. And by the way, if it seems super wet and you can't do this, add a little bit of flour. And on the other hand, if it seems a little too dry, we'll just sprinkle in a little bit of buttermilk until it comes together. So that's just you making biscuits. But anyway, somehow, some way, we will gather that dough together and press it into a rectangle, at which point we will grab our bench scraper, which by the way you must own, and we will fold that in thirds, and then sort of flatten that back out with our hands. And just like virtually all dough-related operations, if it's too sticky, add a little bit of flour. So right there I determined it was a little too wet and sticky, so I dusted it with some flour. And by the time we get that pressed back out into some kind of rectangular shape, our dough should basically now be properly mixed. Okay, had we mixed it further in the bowl, at this point it might be overmixed. But anyway, at this point I'm going to dust it with a little more flour, and then switch to a rolling pin. Because before we start applying our cheese and onions, we want to go ahead and roll this out to about a ½ inch thick. Or maybe just a little thicker than that. So basically we're just going to roll that out until it resembles something like this. And then what we'll do once that's been accomplished is sprinkle over about a ¼ cup of freshly shredded Irish cheddar. And then in addition to the cheese, we'll also scatter over some spring onions, which the rest of the year we call green onions. But this time of the year, especially in Irish recipes, we call them spring onions. And then what we'll do once we have that cheesed and onioned is take our bench scraper and fold that in thirds. And once that's been folded up, we'll kind of press that down. And believe it or not, we're actually going to repeat that process one more time. So again, we'll dust with flour if necessary. And I should mention, when it comes to biscuit dough, you can always add the scraps back in. Okay, just press them right in, and those are going to totally disappear into the rest of the goodness. But anyway, like I said, we're going to roll that back out and apply the rest of our cheese and green onions. Spring onions. And by the way, just because I'm using Irish cheddar in a cheap attempt to convince people this is an Irish recipe, that does not mean you have to use it. Okay, pretty much your favorite cheddar is going to work here. So use whatever you want as long as you promise to grate it yourself. But anyway, once we have our second edition of cheese and onions in, we will fold it in thirds one last time, at which point it's ready to roll out and cut into biscuits. And for the record, there was absolutely no reason for me to pick off that little piece of spring onion, but I did it anyway. Sometimes you just can't help yourself. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and roll that out, to approximately a ½ inch thick. And if you want taller biscuits, just make fewer biscuits and don't roll it out so thin. But because I'm adding cheese, I don't want these to be doughy in the middle. So I do tend to roll them out a little thinner than regular biscuits. And then once that's set, if you want to make life easy, just cut these into squares and bake them. But apparently I didn't want this to be easy. Plus, nature much prefers circles over squares. This is one of the few things we understand about the universe. So I'm going to go ahead and use a round cutter to punch these out. But either will work, and of course that's up to you. You are, after all, the Sylvester Stallone of what some may refer to as a Blarney scone. But anyway, we're going to cut up our biscuits, which will always lead to trimmings. And in this case, probably more than I wanted. And while they won't come out as good as the first batch, we can totally press this extra back together and eventually roll it out into some kind of similar thickness and cut the rest. And yes, I did roll out this piece a little thinner so I could cut 4 biscuits, which of course will have those cook up a little bit differently, but not so much differently that it would cause a problem. But anyway, regardless of whether they were cut from virgin dough or from a bunch of smooshed together scraps, once our biscuits are cut, we'll transfer those onto a parchment-lined baking sheet. And then what we'll do to finish these off before they go in the oven is brush the tops lightly with buttermilk, as well as finish with a couple teaspoons of shredded cheddar on the top of each one. And for you fans of hearing super obvious things, we're adding that for taste and appearance. And that's it. Once our buttermilk and cheese has been applied, we can go ahead and transfer those into the center of a 400-degree oven for about 20 minutes or so, or until our biscuits are cooked through and look something like this. Man, those look good and very cheesy. And as you can see, even though our dough was pretty thin, these really did puff up nicely. And we have some very visible and quite provocative layers. And at this point, you could play that fun game, pick out the ones we made from the scrap dough. So sure, a few might come out not quite as beautiful as the other ones, but that's okay. A slightly imperfect cheddar biscuit is better than no cheddar biscuit at all. I think we can all agree on that. So I went ahead and transferred those beauties to a rack to cool before breaking into one to see how we did. And speaking of imperfect, let me pick out the worst one and test that one, and if this one's good, I know all the rest are going to be amazing. And check it out, it was good. It was light and flaky, with just the right ratio of chewiness to tenderness, and crispy in all the right spots. So I was extremely happy with how these came out, and I really do think this layering method is superior to just mixing the cheese and onions into the dough, which is the most common way to do these. I'm looking at you, national crustacean-based restaurant chain. But anyway, I loved how these came out, so I transferred those into a towel-lined basket for the mandatory biscuits in a basket shot. And those are now ready to pair with things like corned beef and cabbage, or a beautiful Irish stew, or if you're one of these people into hot carb-on-carb action, these would even be great served next to colcannon. Or is it colcannon? I'm not sure. I'm still trying to figure out if it's Celtic or Celtic. But anyway, that's it. Whether you're going to make these for St. Patrick's Day, or just sometime you want a delicious, cheesy, and fairly awesome biscuit, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy